Darius Gentry hired her to cook. That was 3 weeks ago. Every morning since then, Sabrina Tate would appear in his kitchen wearing something that no decent cook should wear while handling food. Today, she stood at his stove in a dress so thin the morning light passed right through it, preparing eggs he hadn't asked for, humming a tune that sounded strangely familiar but impossible to place. The peculiar thing wasn't just her persistence in trying to seduce a man who had made his disinterest painfully clear. The peculiar thing was how she seemed to know exactly how he liked his coffee prepared, though he had never told her. Black, with just a touch of salt instead of sugar, the way his late wife Martha used to make it. A detail so specific, so private, that hearing her mention it casually the first morning had made his blood run cold. But there was something else. Something that gnawed at him during the sleepless hours when he would catch her moving through his house at night. Not stealing, not searching, just walking, as if she belonged there, as if she was looking for something that existed only in her memory. The morning routine had become a dance they both knew the steps to, though neither had taught the other. She would lean against the counter, letting her fingers trail along the wooden surface that bore the knife marks from years of Martha's cooking. She would comment on how the light hit the kitchen table just right at 8:15, creating patterns she claimed reminded her of somewhere she had been before, somewhere she could never quite name. And every morning, when Darius would finally ask her to stop whatever game she was playing, Sabrina would look at him with eyes that held a recognition he couldn't understand. Eyes that seemed to be waiting for him to remember something he was certain he had never known. But this morning was different. This morning, when she handed him the coffee prepared exactly the way Martha used to make it, she whispered something that made the cup slip from his fingers and shatter on the floor. "I know what you did to her, Darius, and I know why you can never tell anyone the truth about how Martha really died." The shattered pieces of the coffee cup lay scattered across the kitchen floor like broken promises. Darius stared at them, his hands trembling not from the shock of the hot liquid, but from the words that had just left Sabrina's lips, words that should have been impossible for her to know. 3 weeks ago, she had appeared at his ranch like a mirage in the desert, a woman claiming to be a cook, carrying nothing but a worn leather bag and references he couldn't verify, because she said the families had moved east. She was educated, well-spoken, and desperate enough to accept half the wages any reasonable cook would demand. In a territory where decent help was scarce and good cooks were rarer than gold strikes, Darius had considered himself fortunate. But fortune, he was learning, often came with a price that wasn't negotiated up front. "I don't know what twisted game you're playing," he said, his voice steady despite the storm building inside his chest. "But Martha died of fever. The whole town knows that. Doc Henderson signed the papers himself." Sabrina knelt gracefully, beginning to collect the broken porcelain with fingers that moved too carefully, as if she had cleaned up similar messes before. "In this very kitchen. Fever," she repeated softly, almost to herself. "Is that what you told them? How convenient that she took ill so suddenly, just days after she discovered your secret." The morning sun streaming through the kitchen window seemed to grow colder. Darius had built his life on the foundation of being known as an honest man, a widower who had loved his wife deeply and mourned her passing with the dignity expected of a respectable rancher. The town's sympathy had been genuine, their support unwavering. To have that foundation questioned by a stranger who spoke as if she had been there, as if she had witnessed something, felt like having the ground pulled from beneath his feet. "You need to leave," he said, but the words came out weaker than he intended. "Pack your things and get off my land." Sabrina stood, holding the broken pieces in her cupped palms. "I could leave," she said. Meeting his eyes with a gaze that held no fear, no uncertainty. "But then who would prepare your coffee the way Martha taught me? Who would know that she always hummed that particular tune while she cooked? Who would understand why you moved her rocking chair from the porch to the barn the day after she died?" Each detail hit him like a physical blow. The coffee preparation was intimate knowledge. The humming had been Martha's unconscious habit, but the rocking chair, that had been his private moment of grief, witnessed by no one, or so he had believed. "Who are you?" he whispered. Sabrina walked to the wash basin, carefully disposing of the broken cup. When she turned back, her expression had shifted into something that looked almost like pity. Someone who knows that secrets have a way of surviving even when the people who keep them don't. And yours, Darius Gentry, is about to come crawling out of its grave. The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Darius felt his chest tighten as memories he had buried deeper than coffins began clawing their way to the surface. He had spent 2 years constructing a careful narrative about Martha's death, rehearsing it until it became truth in his own mind. But this woman, this stranger who moved through his kitchen like she owned it, was unraveling everything with surgical precision. "Martha never taught anyone how to make my coffee," he said, grasping for control. "She was protective of her recipes, kept them to herself." Sabrina smiled, and there was something in that smile that reminded him uncomfortably of Martha when she was about to prove him wrong about something. She was protective, yes, especially when she realized her husband was selling information to the railroad company about which ranchers were planning to sell their land. Information that helped the railroad buy properties for half their worth. The accusation hit him like a physical blow. His secret, the one he had carried like a stone in his chest, spilled out into the open air between them. For months before Martha's death, he had been providing the railroad's land agent with advance notice about struggling ranchers who might be willing to sell. In exchange, he received a percentage of the savings when the railroad acquired the land below market value. It had been business, he told himself, just business. "Martha confronted you about it," Sabrina continued, moving to the kitchen table and running her fingers along its worn surface. "She threatened to expose what you were doing to the other ranchers, said it was theft disguised as commerce, that it went against everything she believed about community and trust. She didn't understand the economics of it," Darius said, but his voice sounded hollow even to himself. "The railroad was coming through anyway. I was just trying to ensure our own survival." "Your survival," Sabrina corrected. "Not hers. Never hers." The kitchen seemed to be closing in around him. Through the window he could see his hired hands beginning their morning routines, unaware that their boss was being systematically destroyed by a woman who shouldn't exist. The normal rhythms of ranch life continued while his world collapsed piece by piece. "The fever story was clever," Sabrina said, settling into Martha's old chair at the table. "Sudden onset, rapid progression, tragic but believable. Doc Henderson was easy enough to convince, especially when you mentioned that Martha had been acting strangely, saying impossible things in her delirium, things about betrayal and dishonesty that made no sense to a rational man. You're suggesting I killed my own wife?" The words came out as a whisper, because saying them louder would make them real. "I'm not suggesting anything," Sabrina replied. "I'm telling you what I know, what Martha knew, and what she tried to tell people before the poison finished its work." The word poison dropped into the conversation like a stone into still water, sending ripples of terror through everything he thought he knew about that night 2 years ago. The night Martha had died in her sleep, peacefully according to the doctor, tragically according to the town, necessarily according to the voice in his head that he had silenced until this moment. But how could this woman know what even he had tried to forget? Darius slammed his fist on the kitchen table, making the salt shaker jump. "You're insane. Martha died of fever, and you're nothing but a disturbed woman spinning fantasies." But even as the words left his mouth, he could feel the lie burning his throat. The night Martha died replayed in his memory like a recurring nightmare. Her sudden illness after dinner, the way she had looked at him with confusion and growing horror as the poison worked through her system, the moment when she realized what was happening and tried to call for help. "Am I?" Sabrina asked calmly. "Then explain why you burned her medicine bottles the morning after she died. Explain why you told Doc Henderson not to examine the body too closely because you couldn't bear to have her disturbed. Explain why you buried her the very next day, instead of waiting for her sister to arrive from town." Each accusation was a nail in a coffin he thought he had sealed permanently. The medicine bottles had contained traces of the rat poison he had mixed into her evening tonic. The quick burial had been necessity, not grief. And Martha's sister, arriving 3 days late, had wept over a grave that already held secrets she would never uncover. "You can't prove any of this," he said, but his voice cracked on the words. Sabrina reached into her dress pocket and withdrew a small glass vial, setting it carefully on the table between them. The morning light caught the glass, casting rainbow patterns across the wooden surface. Inside the vial was a white residue that looked innocuous but filled Darius with cold dread. "This is what was left in Martha's medicine bottle," she said. "The one you thought you had destroyed completely. But glass doesn't burn as thoroughly as you might expect, and sometimes pieces survive with enough residue to tell a story." His hands began to shake. That vial should not exist. He had been careful, methodical. He had smashed every bottle, burned every fragment, scattered the ashes across different parts of his land. The idea that evidence had survived felt like divine punishment for sins he had convinced himself were justified. "Where did you get that?" he whispered. "From someone who was watching that night," Sabrina replied. "Someone who saw you prepare the tonic, saw you add the extra ingredient, saw you deliver it to Martha with a kiss on her forehead. Someone who collected the evidence while you were digging her grave." The implication hit him like lightning. There had been a witness to his crime. Someone who had watched him murder his wife and said nothing for 2 years. Someone who had waited, planned, and now sent this woman to destroy him piece by piece. "Who?" he demanded. "Who was watching?" Sabrina smiled again, that same unsettling expression that reminded him too much of Martha. "Someone closer to this situation than you could possibly imagine. Someone who loved Martha enough to ensure her death wouldn't go unpunished forever." "What do you want from me?" "Justice," she said simply. "But not the kind you're thinking. Not yet." She stood from the table, leaving the vial behind like a threat made manifest. As she moved toward the kitchen door, she paused and looked back at him with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "Martha wrote letters, Darius. Letters about what she discovered, about what she planned to do. Letters she never got the chance to send. But someone found them after she died. Someone who has been planning this moment for 2 years. The mention of Martha's letters sent ice through Darius's veins. He had searched the house thoroughly after her death, looking for anything that might implicate him in her discovery about the railroad deals. He had found nothing, assumed she had kept her suspicions to herself. The possibility that she had documented his betrayal, that evidence of his crimes existed somewhere beyond his control, felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. "There were no letters," he said, but uncertainty leaked into his voice. "I would have found them. Would you?" Sabrina asked, pausing in the doorway. "Martha was clever about hiding things from people she no longer trusted. She knew you would search for anything incriminating after you killed her." The casual way she spoke about his wife's murder, as if it were an established fact rather than an accusation, made his skin crawl. But worse was the realization that Martha had anticipated her own death, had prepared for it. The woman he had lived with for 8 years had been planning for her murder while he was planning to commit it. "She wrote 3 letters, Sabrina continued. "One to the territorial marshal detailing your arrangement with the railroad. One to the other ranchers explaining how you had been betraying them for profit. And one to someone she trusted completely, someone she knew would ensure justice was served even if she couldn't do it herself." Darius felt the walls of his carefully constructed life crumbling around him. Who did she trust? Martha kept to herself, didn't have close friends. Didn't she? Sabrina stepped back into the kitchen, moving with a confidence that seemed to grow stronger with each revelation. "Think carefully, Darius. Who did Martha talk to when she was troubled? Who did she confide in when she felt isolated and betrayed by the man she had married?" He searched his memory desperately, trying to recall Martha's habits in the weeks before her death. She had become secretive, distant, spending long hours away from the house. He had assumed she was avoiding him because of the tension between them, but now he wondered if she had been meeting with someone, sharing her discoveries, planning her response to his betrayal. Her sister lived too far away for regular contact, Sabrina said, reading his confusion. The other ranch wives were too concerned with their own problems. But there was someone else, wasn't there? Someone who came to the house regularly. Someone Martha always made time for. Someone you barely noticed because they seemed so harmless. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The girl. What girl? Sabrina asked, but there was something in her tone that suggested she already knew the answer. Martha's niece, Sarah. She came to visit sometimes, helped with household chores. But she was just a child, maybe 16 years old. Martha wouldn't have involved a child in something like this. Sabrina's smile grew wider, and for the first time since she had arrived at his ranch, it reached her eyes. "You're right about one thing. Martha would never have involved a child in something dangerous. But Sarah isn't a child anymore, is she? And she's been waiting 2 years for the right moment to honor the promise she made to her aunt." The kitchen seemed to tilt around him as understanding crashed over him like a flooding river. The familiar gestures, the intimate knowledge of Martha's habits, the way she moved through his house as if she belonged there. "You're not Sabrina Tate," he whispered. "No," she said softly. "I'm Sarah, Martha's niece, and I've come home to finish what my aunt started." The revelation crashed over Darius like a collapsing barn. Sarah, the quiet girl who used to help Martha with canning and mending, who had seemed to fade into the background whenever he entered a room, had transformed into this calculated woman bent on his destruction. The innocent 16-year-old had vanished, replaced by someone who had spent 2 years planning his downfall with surgical precision. "You were just a child," he said, grasping for the memory of the timid girl who used to visit. "You couldn't have understood what was happening between Martha and me." Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Children see more than adults realize, especially when adults stop paying attention to them. "I was staying here the week Martha died. Remember? Sleeping in the small room off the kitchen. The room with walls thin enough to hear every conversation, every argument, every desperate plea she made for you to stop betraying your neighbors." The memory hit him like a fist to the stomach. Sarah had been visiting that week, helping Martha prepare preserves for winter. He had barely acknowledged her presence, treating her like part of the furniture. The idea that she had been listening, learning, documenting his crimes while appearing to focus on domestic chores filled him with retroactive terror. "I heard her confronting you about the railroad money," Sarah continued, settling back into Martha's chair as if reclaiming territory that had always belonged to her. "I heard her threaten to expose you unless you returned the money and confessed to the other ranchers. And I heard you promise her that you would make things right, that you just needed time to figure out how to fix what you had broken." "She believed me," Darius whispered, remembering Martha's relief when he had agreed to her demands. "She thought I was going to do the right thing. She wanted to believe you," Sarah corrected. "But she wasn't naive. That's why she wrote the letters that same night, while you were supposedly considering your options. She documented everything, including her plan to give you 3 days to confess before she took action herself." The timeline was becoming clearer, and with it, the magnitude of his miscalculation. He had poisoned Martha thinking he was preventing her from exposing him, but she had already created an insurance policy against her own death. And worse, there had been a witness to everything, someone he had dismissed as harmless. "You watched me kill her," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "I watched you murder the only person who ever treated me like family," Sarah replied, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I was coming to the kitchen for water when I saw you preparing her medicine. I watched you add the powder, stir it carefully, taste it to make sure it wouldn't be obvious. I followed you to her room and hid in the hallway while you gave it to her with such tenderness, such false concern for her comfort. Why didn't you stop me? Why didn't you call for help?" Sarah's eyes hardened. "I was 16 years old and terrified. You were a grown man with a reputation for being reasonable and respected. Who would have believed me over you? So I stayed hidden and watched my aunt die slowly, promising her in my heart that someday I would make you pay for what you had done." She reached into her other pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, placing it on the table next to the vial. "This is one of Martha's letters, the one addressed to the territorial marshal. It details not just your arrangement with the railroad but also her suspicions about what you might do to keep her quiet." The paper seemed to glow with malevolent energy in the morning light. Inside that fold was his complete destruction, written in Martha's careful handwriting, authenticated by her death. But something in Sarah's expression suggested that the letter was not the worst of what she had planned for him. Darius stared at the folded letter as if it were a coiled snake ready to strike. The paper that could destroy his reputation, his freedom, his life, lay just inches from his hands, but reaching for it felt like accepting his own execution warrant. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice hollow with defeat. "Money? I can pay you to keep quiet. The railroad deal's brought in enough to set you up comfortably somewhere far from here." Sarah's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "You think this is about money? You think I spent 2 years planning, learning to cook and keep house, changing my name and creating an entire identity just to extort a few dollars from my aunt's murderer?" The scope of her preparation was staggering. She hadn't simply decided to confront him, she had methodically transformed herself into the perfect weapon for his destruction. The scared 16-year-old girl had disappeared completely, replaced by someone who understood patience, planning, and the art of psychological warfare. "Then what?" he demanded. "If you wanted me dead, you could have hired someone. If you wanted me in prison, you could have sent those letters to the marshal years ago. What are you really after?" Sarah stood and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the ranch that spread beyond the house. "I want you to understand what it feels like to lose everything that matters to you. Martha didn't just die that night, Darius. She was terrified, confused, betrayed by the man she had trusted for 8 years. I want you to experience that same terror, that same helplessness. "I am experiencing it," he said desperately. "You've already destroyed everything I thought I knew about my life." "Have I?" She turned back to him, and he was shocked to see tears in her eyes. Not tears of sadness, but of rage so pure it had crystallized into something harder than hatred. "You still have your reputation. Your neighbors still respect you. The town still sees you as the grieving widower who lost his beloved wife to tragic illness. You still sleep in the bed where you planned her murder, still eat at the table where you lied to her face." The accusations cut deeper because they were true. Despite his guilt, despite the nightmares, he had managed to maintain the facade of normalcy. The community's sympathy had been a shield that protected him from consequences and allowed him to continue living the life he had killed to preserve. "I want you to lose all of that," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "But not quickly, not cleanly. I want you to watch it crumble piece by piece, the way I watched Martha die. I want you to feel helpless and alone and terrified, knowing that your destruction is inevitable, but not knowing exactly when or how it will come." She moved back to the table and picked up the letter, holding it like a blade. "This letter goes to the marshal in exactly 7 days. But between now and then, I'm going to dismantle your life methodically. I'm going to plant seeds of doubt about Martha's death with the right people in town. I'm going to let slip details about your financial arrangements that will make your neighbors start asking uncomfortable questions. You're going to torture me for a week before you destroy me completely," he said, understanding flooding through him like poison. "I'm going to give you the same 7 days Martha had between discovering your betrayal and dying from it," Sarah corrected. 7 days to understand what she went through. 7 days to feel the walls closing in around you. 7 days to realize that everything you thought you had accomplished by killing her was temporary. She folded the letter carefully and returned it to her pocket. "And at the end of those 7 days, when you're broken and desperate and completely alone, you're going to confess publicly to what you did. Not because the evidence forces you to, but because you'll want to. Because by then, the guilt will have consumed you completely." Darius felt his last hope crumbling. "And if I refuse? If I run?" Sarah smiled, and this time the expression was purely predatory. "Then you'll discover what I learned from the Comanche raiders who attacked our wagon train 3 months after Martha's funeral. Sometimes the most effective revenge isn't killing your enemy quickly. By the 3rd day, Darius understood what Sarah meant about walls closing in. The whispers had started in town, subtle but persistent. Mrs. Henderson mentioned how strange it was that Martha had seemed perfectly healthy just days before her sudden illness. The bank clerk asked pointed questions about the source of his recent deposits. Even Father Mackenzie pulled him aside after Sunday service to ask if there was anything troubling his conscience that he needed to discuss. Sarah moved through his house like a ghost with a mission, maintaining the pretense of being his cook while systematically destroying his peace of mind. She would hum Martha's favorite songs while preparing meals he couldn't eat. She would rearrange furniture to match exactly how Martha had kept it, erasing the changes he had made after her death. She would leave small reminders of his crime in places where only he would find them. A medicine bottle in his shaving kit, a packet of rat poison among his papers, a pressed flower from Martha's grave on his pillow. The psychological assault was relentless and precise. Every reminder was carefully calculated to keep his guilt festering. Every gesture designed to make him feel as if Martha herself was haunting him through her niece's actions. He stopped sleeping, stopped eating properly, stopped maintaining the facade of normalcy that had protected him for 2 years. On the 5th day, desperation drove him to action. He waited until Sarah left for town, then searched the house frantically for Martha's letters and any other evidence she might have hidden. He tore through her belongings, emptied drawers, checked every possible hiding place. But Sarah had anticipated this. She had left nothing for him to find except a single note on his pillow that read, "Looking for something? The letters are safe with someone you'll never find." 2 days left. That night, he seriously considered running. He could saddle his fastest horse, take what money he had hidden, and disappear into the territories where law was scarce and questions were rarely asked. But something Sarah had said kept echoing in his mind. She had learned things from Comanche raiders about effective revenge. The implication was clear. If he ran, she would follow. If he tried to escape, she would make his eventual capture far worse than whatever faced him here. The 6th day brought Father Mackenzie to his door, claiming that several parishioners had expressed concerns about Darius's spiritual welfare. The conversation was gentle but probing. filled with references to the healing power of confession and the importance of unburdening one's soul before God. It was masterfully orchestrated, and Darius realized that Sarah had been preparing the community to receive his confession, making it seem like a natural evolution of grief and guilt rather than a forced admission. That evening, as Sarah prepared what he knew would be his last meal as a free man, she spoke without looking at him. "Tomorrow is Martha's birthday. She would have been 34. I think it's fitting that tomorrow is also the day you finally tell the truth about how she died. What happens to you after tomorrow?" he asked. Surprised by his own curiosity about her fate, Sarah turned, and for the first time since revealing her identity, she looked uncertain. "I don't know. I've spent so long planning your destruction that I haven't thought about what comes after. Maybe that's enough. Maybe watching you face justice for what you did will finally let Martha rest in peace." But something in her eyes suggested that peace, for either of them, was still a long way off. The seventh morning arrived gray and cold, matching the weight in Darius's chest. He found Sarah in the kitchen, dressed in black, preparing coffee with mechanical precision. She had laid out Martha's letters on the table, along with a vial of poison residue and a detailed timeline she had written documenting every aspect of his crime. "It's time," she said simply. They walked together to the center of town where a crowd had already gathered for the weekly market. Sarah had chosen the location carefully. Everyone who mattered would be there. The sheriff, the judge, the pastor, the newspaper editor, and dozens of neighbors who had respected Darius for years. Standing before them, with Sarah beside him holding the evidence of his guilt, Darius felt the final walls of his deception crumble. The weight of 2 years of lies, sleepless nights, and festering guilt finally became unbearable. When he opened his mouth to speak, the words came pouring out like water through a broken dam. He confessed everything. The railroad deals, the money he had stolen from his neighbors through betrayal, Martha's discovery of his crimes, her threat to expose him, and the deliberate poisoning that had ended her life. He described the planning, the execution, the cover-up, and the 2 years of living with her blood on his hands. The crowd listened in stunned silence as their image of the grieving widower shattered completely. When he finished, Sarah stepped forward and handed Martha's letters to Sheriff Collins. "Everything he just confessed is documented here, in my aunt's handwriting. She wrote these letters the night before she died, knowing that he might kill her to protect his secrets. She wanted to ensure that the truth would survive even if she didn't." The sheriff read Martha's words aloud, her careful documentation of Darius's betrayal, and her fears about what he might do to silence her. The crowd's silence turned to angry murmurs as they realized how completely they had been deceived. These people had comforted a murderer, had brought food to the man who had poisoned his wife, had mourned alongside someone who deserved only their contempt. Darius was arrested immediately. The territorial marshal arrived 3 days later and transported him to the capital for trial. The evidence was overwhelming, the confession complete, and the verdict swift. He was sentenced to hang for murder and to forfeit all his assets to compensate the ranchers he had cheated through his railroad arrangement. The ranch was sold at auction. Sarah used her inheritance, the money from the property sale, to establish a fund for widows in the territory, ensuring that women like Martha would never again be so vulnerable to the men who controlled their lives. She never returned to the ranch after Darius's arrest. Some said she moved east to start a new life, away from the memories that had consumed her for 2 years. Others claimed she stayed in the territory but under a different name, helping other women whose husbands had secrets worth killing for. 6 months after his confession, Darius was executed in the town square of the territorial capital. His last words were an apology to Martha, though whether it was genuine remorse or final manipulation, no one could say. The house where Martha had died and where Sarah had planned her revenge stood empty for years, a monument to the truth that secrets buried in haste have a way of clawing their way back to the surface. Eventually, a new family moved in, unaware of the history contained within those walls. But Martha's story lived on, told and retold, as a warning about the price of betrayal and the persistence of justice. And somewhere in the territory, a woman who had once been called Sarah continued the work her aunt had started, ensuring that powerful men who thought they could escape consequences for their crimes learned otherwise. Justice, as Martha had written in her final letter, sometimes takes longer than expected. But it arrives eventually, carried by those who refuse to let the dead rest unavenged. If you enjoyed this story, Click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where justice and revenge collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.